Dear guests, welcome at today's NIAS talk at Spui 25. Both to our guests here and our audience, both to our audience here and to the viewers online, welcome. Today's program is called Uncommon Transitions, Memory and Forgetting Between Eastern and Western Europe. My name is Eveline Veen, and I'm a contemporary historian and work for NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, and I will be your moderator today. This talk is part of the monthly NIAS Talk series here at Spui 25. Every year, NIAS welcomes around 50 Dutch and international scholars, artists, writers, and journalists who work on individual and interdisciplinary research projects in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. During the NIAS talks, we ask our fellows, together with invited guests, on stage to engage with a broader public. Today we will look at a pivotal moment in history, the fall of the Iron Curtain that divided Europe and the world in East and West. Our speakers will share their knowledge and insight on this transition that started in the 1980s and continued well into the 1990s and even today. We ask, what do we remember? But even more so, what did we forget? We will do this in two ways. First, our 5 panelists will briefly tell us something about this transition in different areas of the so-called former Eastern Bloc. Then we will have a panel discussion on stage where you, the audience, can join the conversation with questions. Due to the amount of speakers and not wanting to overcrowd the stage, I will introduce the speakers in advance and join them again after the last panel speaker. Our first speaker will be Xenia Robbe. She is an assistant professor of European culture and literature at the University of Groningen. She is currently also a NIAS fellow. She will start by outlining the questions that generate this conversation, and after that will outline 2 major narratives concerning memory of the 1980s and 1990s. Then Dorine Schellens, a university lecturer at the Center for the Arts in Society at Leiden University, takes us to the former GDR and tells us more on how currently the East German perspective is taking its place in literature, art, and online communication, opposed to the West German perspective that has been dominant until now. Gunas Sipkatulina is an assistant professor for the illiberal regimes in the Department of History, European Studies, and Religion Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She will focus on conflicting memories in the 1990s in Russia, focusing particularly on the case of the Tatarstan. Then Anna David, associate professor, my apologies, of sociology at the University Business Academy in Novi Sad, assistant research fellow at the University of Leuven, and also a current NIAS fellow, will highlight how the post-1989 transition lacked critical reflexivity and focuses on the effects of sectarian nationalism in the post-Yugoslav space. Our final panelist, Ukrainian-born Katarina Gorodinska, will share an abstract of her essay, Dreams Are Made of Porcelain, Really? Katarina grew up in Germany and as a graphic designer, researcher, and cultural programmer focuses on questions around publishing, community building, and curating. After Katarina, I will join our 5 panelists back on stage. I hereby invite Xenia.
Yes, thank you very much, Eveline, for your warm welcome, and for everyone for coming here on such a sunny, lovely day. Thanks for your interest. So I start by explaining how come we planned this event, why we wanted to talk about this topic. So I think the idea started through our conversations, which would commonly come back to this point within this wonderful group of colleagues, but also within the bigger community of scholars interested in these periods. So the question of where are memories of these late 20th century political, economic, sociocultural, all-encompassing transformations. Where are they in Europe in which we are living now? How are these times commemorated in public spaces? How are they referred to in the media? How are they taught at schools or even universities? And we're posing these questions now in relation to the Netherlands and the broader Western Europe, whatever it is, where we all live and work. But they can, of course, and we will be asking them also in the context of societies of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. In these contexts, there are plenty of living memories, of course, all over the place, but hardly any public remembrance, consolidated public remembrance, public memory that regards transitions critically, that regards them as problems, as crises, in all their contradictions, ambiguities, and their impact on our present. So, of course, there are also institutionalized memories, especially celebrating the victory of 1989, but they're typically very cliched. Because getting into the longer-term aftermaths of these events is often uncomfortable. It brings out questions about violence that took place during those times, and that defines our times as well. Questions about responsibility, questions about the seeds of contemporary wars and conflicts that had probably been sown then as well. So we call this event Uncommon Transitions, referring to several meanings of this word common and playing with it. So firstly, asking what has actually been shared or common between the so-called East and West, then and now. And also how these tumultuous and violent periods have been seen in Western Europe, oftentimes as common occurrence over there, and something natural happening in Eastern Europe and not common here. Common for us, not common for them and not common for us. Perhaps one of the few common aspects of remembering those times in the East and West, and globally, I would say, is the sense of disappointment, of betrayed promises, and of lost hopes. And also the contested and unsettled character of memory of this past. The lacking public representation of this period beyond cliches, the lacking vocabulary of memory institutions to speak about contradictions that make, and this is something that makes these memories resurface and cause more unsettlement, especially during the eruptions of crisis, such as we are living through now. So these were just a few words to introduce the topic. And now I'll be moving to my part. Let's say, okay, so here we begin. I will just, in these few minutes that I have, I will outline my main thesis. And this is that. So that memory of transitions in the midst of all the forgetting that we're going to talk about and the cacophony of voices is characterized by two more or less consolidated narratives. The first one is narrative of heroic overcoming, of communist tyranny, Soviet tyranny, whatever you call it. And the second narrative is that of disappointment, of trauma, and of lost hopes, which actually reinforces in many ways the first narrative, that these hopes were legitimate. So even though I mainly work on literature, films, and art, in a recent project, I'm looking together with colleagues at museums. So how museums in particularly two countries, in Poland and in Germany, represent this period. And there are actually very, very few museums in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, even fewer, that focus particularly on this period and exclusively on this period. So one of them is the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk. Here we see precisely this heroic narrative of overcoming. It, of course, focuses on the activities and the hottest phase of activities of the Solidarność movement in the 70s and 80s. But it creates a longer narrative through the timelines. You'll only see a short part of it, but it basically stretches from the end of the Second World War until 1989. And that's where it ends. And it connects all sorts of events, protests, movements, resistances into one homogeneous narrative of struggling against the communist system. This is this optimistic narrative that treats transitions as beacons of hope. It goes against the official memory in contemporary Poland and positions itself as European. And these narratives are quite common. They are well received among certain constituencies, communities in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. What is interesting in our research, we discovered that these narratives also exist in contemporary authoritarian Russia, in this very peculiar institution, which is called the Yeltsin Center in Yekaterinburg. Here we curiously also see this narrative of struggling against the communist power. It focuses on the life story of Boris Yeltsin, after whom the museum is named, and who was born in Yekaterinburg, so it's in his hometown. But along with this narrative is, of course, impossible to ignore the economic crisis of this period and all sorts of violence, crime, and so on. So the museum focuses on that as well. So, for example, there is a room which is dedicated to scarcity, lack of goods, empty shelves. And they also organize events to discuss how people survived that period. So, for example, this one was called, a discussion was called Practices of Survival. So how we survived this period. What is curious enough is that this narrative puts the whole blame and the whole responsibility for this economic crisis onto the deficiencies of the Soviet system and of the perestroika. So it doesn't mention the privatization that took place in the 90s, the shock therapy, the massive poverty of the 90s. So it just shows how the crisis was inevitable. The effects of this crisis were experienced in the 90s, and then they were overcome during our bright present. So in this, it's really quite similar with the narrative of the European Solidarity Center. This is about museums. And so I would call these both narratives variants of the catching up revolution. So catching up with the West, with an eye to the West. The term was coined by Jürgen Habermas in his 1990 book. It was critiqued a lot by Eastern European intellectuals, in particular Boris Buda in his 2009 book. But still, despite these critiques, we see it very prevalent and replicated. Now moving to literature and to this very famous author, Belarusian author Svetlana Alexievich, whose work you might know, and her latest book, which is called Secondhand Time, which has been translated into many, many languages and has been a global bestseller. And she received a Nobel Prize in 2015 after the publication of this book. So I'm referring to this book because it has been quite influential in shaping our perception of what post-Soviet transitions felt like and how they are remembered by people in the 2010s. So she interviewed a lot of people and she quotes their testimonies and presents them as authentic. But at the same time, she frames them through a lot of different devices and also through her commentaries. And the narrative that is framed, is created in such a way, is quite homogeneous. And it basically tells a story of how many people in Russia, Belarus, and other post-Soviet countries haven't stopped being Soviet, so to say. And this narrative, of course, forgets the multiple transformations that people were going through in adapting, resisting, dealing with very harsh and difficult circumstances. And the last example that I'm stopping at is the very recent film, the documentary film by Adam Curtis, which came out last year. It's available on YouTube in open access, so you can watch it. It's in 7 parts. It's quite a long one. And Adam Curtis is a former BBC reporter who worked in Russia, And the film is based on footage from BBC archives, supplemented by commentaries by the director. So he explains, and so in this way creates also very much creates and directs the narrative just like Alexievich does. So many things can be said about this film, but I just say what I appreciate regarding it, because like Alexievich's book, it foregrounds this state of trauma of post-Soviet societies. It mainly focuses on Russia from 85 to 99, but it also includes footage from Ukraine and from Poland. So I remember just these two countries, but yeah, so it's not only Russia, but it somehow frames it as being a Russian narrative. So it foregrounds the traumatic states and people suffering, and what especially is important, and that's one of the first narratives that brings it out in this very clear and obvious way, the responsibility of the elites, both in Russia, political, economic elites, and also the Western elites, states and business elites who were supporting this transformation, which disadvantaged the majority of the population and brought the country to crisis, and also brought Putin to power. So I will stop here. I just want to wrap up by pointing at the importance of unpacking very specific sides, unlike these generalizing narratives, specific sides of suffering, trauma, disillusionment, lack of agency during this period, as also precursors to what has happened with Russian society more recently. And also, in terms of scholarship, this topic is becoming a subject of research, and I want to point at two forthcoming books coming out in the next couple of months. One is by my colleagues Veronika Peche and Joanna Wawrzyniak, including many cases from many Eastern European countries, and the book I edited, Remembering Transitions, Local Revisions and Global Crossings, focusing on the media, and also including some examples from countries of the Global South. Thank you.
When we say former East and former West today, what do these two regions look like in your head if you picture them? What countries do you think hide behind these two concepts, and where do you imagine the border between them? In my presentation, I will zoom in on a country that no longer exists, and this is, as you might have already guessed from this map, the German Democratic Republic, or DDR. The GDR's position as a former border zone between Western and Eastern Europe makes it, I think, a very interesting case study for today's discussion. However, precisely this regional position, as well as its unique history, also makes that it often falls outside of the scope of our research and thinking, either on post-1989 trajectories of the former East or of those of the former West. It is a country that after 41 years ceased to exist, and as such it seems to fall between two stools, you could perhaps say. But although the state borders of the GDR have disappeared on contemporary maps of Germany, it still seems to lead a little bit of a map zombie existence, as journalist and blogger Frank Jacobs puts it. Especially around big elections in Germany, newspapers tend to publish maps on which the contours of the former GDR pop up again. They become visible to us again. We see them, I've put a couple of examples on the slide, for example, on maps visualizing unemployment rates in Germany, per capita income, or voting tendencies. And the message behind such maps is usually that Germany is not a country that is defined by mere regional differences. The message is that it is a country that after more than 3 decades is still defined by an ongoing divide between what is still referred to as the old and new German states, or Bundesländer. And the information that we find on such maps is, of course, not wrong. We really do see differences in income, in poverty levels, or voting preferences between the former Eastern and Western German states for reasons that we can also explain. However, what I think is important is that we should not forget that these maps and also the questions that inform them in the first place are not neutral, and as such they only tell a limited story. And this is a story that is part, I would say, of a larger discourse on the way in which we collectively remember and tell the history of the fall of the German Wall and also the German reunification. And if we think about this story in a very simplified way, This is a culture of remembrance that is structured around the following plot, you could say, just like a book or a movie. And this plot is, I think, as follows. What once belonged together got separated, but was reunited in the end, which required, and still requires, the former Eastern states to undergo a process of catching up with the West. That is the narrative that also Xenia just mentioned. However, we are also witnessing currently some shifts, some cracks in this master narrative, in particular, I think, from the side of a generation of writers and academics born in the last years of the GDR's existence. In an interview about her recently published novel Die Möglichkeit von Glück, or The Possibility of Happiness, Eastern German author Anne Rabe underlines the necessity of creating more knowledge, more awareness about how the specific history, also collective mentality of the GDR influenced the aftermath of the transition period. Or, as she puts it in this interview, es reicht nicht, die DDR immer nur vom Ende her zu erzählen. It is not enough to always tell the story of the GDR from the end. And to illustrate this point a little bit further, I want to turn to a recent novel by the acclaimed writer Jenny Erpenbeck. I also brought the book today. It's coming out in English also very soon. Jenny Erpenbeck, born in 1967 in East Berlin. The title of my talk, Catching Kairos, is inspired by this novel, Kairos, from 2021. In ancient Greece, Kairos was the god of opportunity, of the right time or the opportune time to act. And as you can see here, he's often depicted with a large lock of hair on his forehead, so that can be grasped. And timing is really of the essence here, because once he has passed, it is impossible to catch him due to the back of his head being bald. In Erpenbeck's novel, Kairos is used as a metaphor, you could say, for the love story of the two protagonists, which are, on the one hand, the 19-year-old student Katharina and the much older and also married writer Hans, who is in his 50s. These two protagonists meet by chance, Kairos, at a bus stop in East Berlin and start an affair that very soon develops into a very toxic relationship that involves psychological but also sometimes physical abuse from the side of Hans. We follow Katharina and Hans over the course of 6 years, from 1986 until 1992. And this way we do not only see their relationship developing, but also the final years of the GDR and the immediate aftermath of the German reunification. And we do so through the eyes of two generations who relate to the GDR in very different ways. We have Hans, on the one hand, who was born in the 1930s, also lived through the Second World War, who is someone who is very convinced communist. So even when he's faced with state violence, also societal decline at the end of the 80s, he really sticks to this foundational myth of the GDR as an anti-fascist state that was resurrected out of ruins, or auferstanden aus Ruinen, as the first line of the country's national anthem read. Katharina, on the other hand, has a much more open, much more, less utopian attitudes towards the GDR. And this is something that often worries Hans, who says in the novel, and I'm citing the English translation, "What can such creatures of the new age do with the future who no longer know the reason on which the future stands or was built?" Several months into their relationship, Hans starts reading Katharina's very different outlook on life, also the way that she adapts and responds to the changes in society of the late 1980s in a much more flexible way, as a sort of personal betrayal to his convictions, to which he responds with abuse. We follow both protagonists in the early 1990s, when initial attempts to reform socialism end with the dismantling of the economic and political structures of the GDR and its integration in the Bundesrepublik. Or, as Hans states in a very pessimistic way in the novel, until April 1919, there is sometimes still talk of cooperation between the two states. After that, only of accession. In the end, Jenny Appenbeck's novel, Kairos, offers no easy answer. It offers no one-dimensional perspective on the transition period and its aftermath. With Katharina and Hans, we instead have the voices of two generations who deal with the upheavals very differently. And the strength of the novel for me also lies in the fact that Kairos, so the god of opportunity or the right time to act, means something very differently for both of them. So much like the novel doesn't really present a fixed conclusion or a fixed answer, I would also like to end not with a conclusion myself, but rather with a question that the novel poses. When does the after begin? Wann beginnt das danach? How have we as individuals and societies dealt with the critical turning points of the late 1980s, both in the former East, but also over here in the former West? Have we really caught Kairos, or were there other opportunities that we let pass by? And if so, how can we rethink the after? Thank you.
Following my colleagues, I would like to focus more on personal experiences currently. As someone who was born in the 90s but remembers the decades based on the stories and pictures told by our parents. And as well as Xenia already introduced, I will be focusing on the case of Russia, but particularly on a smaller republic that still continues to be part of the Russian Federation at the moment, specifically Tatarstan. Because in parallel with the memories of the 90s as an episode of big trauma that we're still trying to overcome, there were also some positive memories, the memories that connected to the national movements that were in that republic. On the 30th of August 1990, so just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tatarstan, which constitutes a part of the Russian Federation and one of the Muslim majority republics, took a declaration, accepted a declaration of sovereignty. In this declaration, it took a stance saying that republic in itself, although a part of the bigger country, deserves certain degree of recognition and freedom in handling its own political, cultural, and economic relationship. And later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, the majority of the population voted in favor of this declaration, saying that indeed, in the current reality, the majority, 60% of the population, still would like the Tatarstan to be a sovereign republic. In the memory of those who witnessed the processes, so my parents, my older friends, the 19th symbolized a moment of pride, the moment of unity, of ethnic group coming together. This small ethnic group united itself in order to advocate for its political rights, freedom to speak and study its own ethnic language, and profess its religion, which is different from majority population, freely. Tatarstan, in this 90s memory, has been long contrasted to another Muslim republic, Chechnya, that took another path in the 90s and namely underwent a horrible and very disastrous wars, equally in a struggle for its own sovereignty. The pride in the case of Tatarstan was also co-opted to some extent by the state, which showcased this republic as an example of how different ethnic groups and different religions can coexist together. In 2020, the Republic celebrated 30 years of the anniversary of the declaration. This time, younger Tatars, so those who were born already in the 90s, took a public action of reading out excerpts from the document of the 90s. For many, Tatar was not the language they grew up with, and not all of them could speak the language freely. And reading some of the promises made in the 90s against the realities of Russia in the 20s was striking. Not all the promises that made in the 90s were fulfilled. The Republic had been steadily losing its right and control over local politics and economy. Since 2015, Tatar is not obligatory to learn at schools, which means an inevitable decline in language proficiencies. As someone who was born in the 90s, I remember this decade based on the stories and pictures. As the decades of indeed a turbulence of economic hardship, organized crime, but also of indeed ethnic group and Tatar unity. However, now in 2023, many of my generation look into the 90s to understand what is happening with the country today. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine revealed existing differences in Russia across regions, classes, ethnic groups, and importantly, generations. The fact that ethnic minorities were overrepresented among Russian war casualties reminded that ethnic minority questions were not resolved, and in some cases even exaggerated. The recent events in Ukraine and war atrocities have revived the memories of the war in Chechnya that also received a different light in the current circumstances. And in the moment of chaos and unbelief that many of us experienced in 2022 and continue to have today, we do see that there is also a huge difference between generations. It was easy for us to blame the elders for mistakes, as we thought, that made in the 90s. They did agree on things they shouldn't have done. They didn't push for things that were possible at the moment, that they voted for people whom we didn't want to have in power. And it's easy to blame the elders, and the elders, of course, will not be easily convinced to take the position of the youngers. The current crisis of alienation of generations is a risk to create another rupture that country already experienced several times. Yet also experience of other countries, and this is thanks to conversation with my colleagues, we do believe that there is a possibility of creating another memory of the 90s, not so much of indeed the blame and rupture, but instead a compassion and of understanding. Much remains to be seen how the processes will evolve and how generations will come together depending on the current developments in the conflict resolution, political processes in Russia, and of course the activities of the diaspora. It is true that from this point, this process of reconciliation and of creating a new narratives of the 90s will be a long process and a difficult one, but hopefully a productive one. Thank you.
In my brief talk, I'd like to draw your attention to the ways in which the explanations of the end of socialism were marked by a lack of critical reflexivity that is still with us today. The responsibility for the lack of reflexivity lies with us academic researchers as much as with political practitioners and the media. A long time ago, political sociologist Klaus Offe was among the few rare analysts of the nature of the collapse of socialist, that is, communist regimes, who already at the time that they were occurring warned us that such transitions were unprecedented and hence required new theoretical, analytical, and practical rigor. He wrote that they were triple transitions, socialist, economic, and political transformations that were unprecedented in the passage from dictatorships that occurred throughout the 20th century elsewhere. Very few, it seems, listened to the calls for some slower analysis of the implosion of political regimes in the days, the years of grand and in many ways understandable euphoria of the late 80s and early 90s. It took hold, this euphoria, firmly since the years of perestroika and glasnost, the reforms that Gorbachev had unleashed in the second half of the 80s, and the seemingly, at the time, casualty-less in disintegration of the Soviet Union. The unknown, at the time, causalities between the collapse of complex, non-transparent, even for insiders, power webs, and the societies no less complex than anywhere else, yet driven and stalled by their dependencies on political wills that were changing fast. The knowledge of the coming transitology was very much informed by the policies of the West, that is, Western aid to post-communist states, as it was called, restructuring, via the work of the International Monetary Fund, setting the rules of capitalist game and the new dependencies, the funding schemes and political aid of multi-state organizations where the EU was coming in later, being dormant in the beginning, and a plethora of Western-funded NGOs that focused on the apparent drive to what everyone considered to be normalcy in the formerly socialist communist countries. That normalcy meant the apparent desire of entire populations to re-enter the uniform path, what was already mentioned today, the catching up, the uniform path of capitalist markets and liberal democracies, to be like the rest of, well, not the rest of the whole world, but the desired West. What was passing less noticed at the time behind this apparent consensus over the normalization was first what one can call cold revenge or structural revenge of this return to normalcy. By this I mean the transformation of property and the rights to property and assets from public, that is state, to private hands that took place as a process of usurpation during the privatization processes. The usurpation of capital assets and vast industrial and residential properties, the land turned real estate, also led to many losing their jobs, the worsening of labor conditions, the disappearance of pension funds and hitherto guaranteed social benefits. On top of it, as the surveys confirm also today, post-socialist citizens felt and still feel largely excluded from political decision-making, seeing elections as a mere reshuffling of the same political structures and groups. The economic impoverishment, new class polarizations, and subsequent social disorientation of the citizens was depicted as a temporary ailment that those who knew how would easily overcome, just catching up with the West, meaning the liberal, the free, and the cool. The real problems of the majorities who could not catch up. Here is a scene from a rare film from the mid-90s that depicted a group of people who were losers, a film by a Hungarian director, Ibolya Fekete, people who were trying to believe in the promise of everything that is Western and cool, and yet one after another become the losers of the great transformations. The real problems of the majorities who could not catch up, who could not reach the greater life just by accepting the new order of things, were at the times relegated to the realm of simply coping with the inevitable of the maladjusted, to what was in reality new polarization, inequalities, and injustices. The hot revenge of the transition came in the face of exclusivist identitarian politics, of nationalisms, where the majority ethnicities in each country claimed their natural hegemony and natural democratic, here the paradox, natural democratic rights over their minorities. The victorious ethno-religious nationalisms and new minoritization of minorities in new post-socialist states seem to have overnight swept away what the dissident intellectuals in Poland, Czechoslovakia, the USSR, Hungary, and elsewhere, as well as their Western correspondents throughout the 60s and 70s, have thought and wrote about for decades, that the end of communism would pave way first and foremost to individual liberties and creativities and solidarity with the most marginalized and rightless. Instead, the victorious ethno-religious nationalisms, along with the repatriarchalization and reclericalization, became vehicles of what I call the multi-layered estrangement from both personal and collective biographies. The hot revenge thus became a colorful, often violently colorful screen for the cold structural resetting. I dedicate my talk to Dubravka Ugrešić, a writer originally from Yugoslavia, now Croatia, writer from nowhere, as she preferred to call it, who lived and recently passed away in Amsterdam. Having this in mind, my attempts to unstrange the socialist past from the state of post-confusion focus on the consequences of nationalist violence in the post-Yugoslav region, what Dubravka Ugrešić called the culture of lies and hijacked memories. In the remaining very few minutes, I'm just going to run you through the visuals of the post-Yugoslav desert of post-socialism. I borrowed this from the two colleagues, sociologists of the New Left, Igor Štiks and Srećko Horvat, drawing here your attention to the consequences of the nationalist wars upon both the memories of socialism and the diagnosis of its ending. Oops. I'm running you now very quickly through the fate of various monuments to Second World War, the memorials to anti-fascist struggle, the main battles that took place in what was Yugoslavia, primarily in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where the main battles during the Second World War occurred. Here is the cemetery that was destroyed in several instances. The culmination took place last year in July, where it was throughout the night destroyed stone by stone. Here's a very interesting way of dealing with anti-fascist memorials. Here is one as it stood before in the left, and now it is complemented by the newly built Orthodox Church that stands by its side. Here is quite an ordeal, was to actually climb this monument and take down the hero who was standing on top of it. And here it lies already for many years in the yard around this plateau. Here is the fate of the socialist-era house of culture. They were typical even for small towns throughout what was Yugoslavia and elsewhere in the socialist world. This stage where cinema shows were held and theater groups would pass visiting the place near Zvornik in eastern Bosnia, this became the place of torture and execution during the 90s in the war. And this is the place that still stands with the signs of torture on its walls. In my newest project, I'm dealing with artistic activism, where artists in the place of what was Yugoslavia try to address the places of disappearance. This is a collage that shows the place where the monument that was destroyed stood, and it's a combination of a scene from a Western film coming to an object that appears coming from a sci-fi film. In the films by younger film directors, it seems to be the focus not on human beings, but on objects, on debris, on waste, on the abandonment. These are the films that deal with the war crimes and the consequences of war crimes that pass on as a cover-up in the societies that do not want to recognize the war crimes that committed by our side. So to end, I want to say that omission and invisibility become strategies of political subversion, where speaking about things openly does not seem to be an option. The use of strong absences, suggestive emptiness, deliberate fog, blurred contours, avoidance of human presence suggests scenes and actions of new heritage seeking, away and against the official memories, pointing to how important it is not just how history is remembered, but also how it is neglected, distorted, and forgotten. This type of artistic activism that goes against the official ceremonial memorizing of homogeneous national history may be, perhaps in the future, a redeemer for both the memories of socialism and what came after. And my question in the end is, can futures be assembled out of ruins? Thank you.
Okay, hello. I will read from an article called Dreams Are Made of Porcelain that was published in the Stedelijk Studies Journal this year. And I will skip small fragments, but if you want to catch up on the fragments that are missing, you can still read it online. And I will start. 1. There in relation to a here. I want to start with a Soviet game called Sekretiki, which translated means little secrets. Children dig a hole in the ground, throw in everything colorful they can find, blooming flowers, shiny stones, shimmering doll clothes. Then place a piece of glass over the pit, cover it with earth, and run away. Only when they feel unobserved, they return, expose the spot again, and view their secret treasures through the glass. Things that were once objects disappear in order to later become images. Thinking of porcelain, I'm thinking of white porcelain. I'm thinking of my parents selling all their porcelain books and belongings at the 7-kilometer market in Odessa before moving to Germany with 3 of those plate plastic bags. There was no Punchlina Puncheon doll, no Roly Poly Daruma, no first teddy bear to find in my family's new house. Growing up in Germany, I was missing something which I later learned to call a migrant shelf. Some newspapers on the table no one would have had the time to read, just some useless objects which were nothing more than carriers of memory and history. While Svetlana Boym writes that diasporic intimacy is possible only when one masters a certain imperfect aesthetics of survival and learns to inhabit exile, my parents were happy when they could afford to buy new porcelain. I want to take this white porcelain as a starting point to think about objects without a history, about looking more into a future than into a past. 2. Something about the future. Back then, no one traveled from Ukraine, but my father was a shipbuilding engineer, which in Odessa is the same as a mechanical engineer in Dortmund, and my mother was definitely proud when he brought a suit, a camera, and turbulent chocolate from overseas. After this, he opened a textile factory at the 7-kilometer market. I used to tell everyone that it is called 7 kilometer because of being 7 kilometer long, until I realized that this is not true, but it still does make a good story. 7 kilometers of chewing gum next to counterfeit shirts, next to some flower wallpapers for your bedroom and laminate for your kitchen floor. Once, after being given one of those friends' journals where you were asked to write down your favorite dish, your favorite song, and your dream, I wrote behind the semicolon for dream, travel to Paris. Now, as I again try to visualize a possible little secret, I suddenly see a photograph of Paris lying there, an image of the Eiffel Tower being behind glass being found in the courtyard of a house in Odessa. Georges Perec starts his book, Things, a Story of the 60s, with a whole chapter which consists entirely of a description of an apartment the main characters of his novel imagine to live in. The eye, at first, would glide over the grey carpet of a long hallway, tall and narrow. The reader does not get to know the main characters. Instead of dialogues and names, there are only descriptions of rooms, of furniture someone wants to have, maybe lighting that would accompany it in a nice way. Imagining yourself in an apartment which does not exist is an act of creating a virtual space. While a place has a smell, a touch, a sound, the virtual space is only accessible to sight. Maybe our virtual house has a big leather couch, a TV, some indirect lighting, but no carpet. For sure, no carpet. Who really still has a carpet? A wooden table, plants, different cacti, an orchid. White leather chairs in front of a big kitchen island, white chairs around the table, another TV. Superficially, it might seem easy to interpret a world where there are so few elements. Only behind the closed door of an overcrowded fridge, I suddenly picture these huge jars with self-made pickled cucumbers. Sometimes there's also some pickled tomatoes or pickled cabbage. Even here in this house, you cannot flee completely from telling a story. 3. Something about the future, so that we first have to take a look into the past. In the podcast Kitchen Conversations, in which Patricia Dasvora proposes an alternative space to think about the diverse region of the so-called Eastern Europe, with all its complexities, histories, cultures, traumas, Christina Tasheva talks in one episode about her experience of migrating from Bulgaria to the Netherlands. And now we try to work as much as possible, but one day it will be different. One day I will become the person I want to be. One day I will have the house I dream of. One day I will have the job I dream of. But life goes on, and for many people this one day never comes. I want to tell you a story about Palina. When asked about her favorite Ukrainian food, Palina doesn't know what to answer. She usually would tell the story which she thinks already tells a lot. Black olives have been her favorite food as a child, and this somehow already illustrates that the kitchen she knows from Odessa is somehow more close to the Mediterranean kitchen than to something she would consider as traditionally Ukrainian, and somehow she doesn't know why. Palina is also a bit proud of this fact. Why, asks she, does knowledge always move towards the east and not from the east? Now I'm skipping. 0. I want to come back to the idea of looking and living with the past through objects. Let us imagine a dusty attic. It is a place the sun rarely visits. Maybe there are some boxes lying around in a corner. In her book, In Memory of Memory, Maria Stepanova takes the event of her aunt's death to sift through an apartment full of faded photographs, old postcards, letters, diaries, and heaps of souvenirs. While writing a multi-faced essay on the collective nature of remembering through the lens of a Russian Jewish family, Stepanova's journey starts in a dusty attic and ends with the notion that there is maybe nothing to find there, that there is not such a thing as one collective story one can tell through some objects found in a house. What, really, can a single object tell us if it is brought out of context, and if there is no person who can tell you a story about it? And what if you suddenly realize that some of the stories you've been told were simply not true? While searching for objects and little secrets which might be found under glass, I switched positions without noticing, and suddenly it was me lying there and watching what was happening around me the whole time. Suddenly, I realized that next to the objects which were missing in our house, also my family and myself were missing in Ukraine. After the very short and small glance into the cultural changes starting with the Orange Revolution when I was 14, my parents never returned to Odessa. But I did many years later, 2 years before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and while the war in the east of the country was already ongoing for a long time. I was not there when the uprising started. I never participated in it. I never learned the Ukrainian language. While I'm finishing this text, it is now already 9 months since the full-scale Russian invasion, and today I'm asking myself, who would think of nostalgia now in Ukraine? Who really still wants to listen to these Russian songs? Which past I will look back to when we refer to concepts such as reflective nostalgia or critical melancholy, if different stories from different times, different stories in different regions at the same time would give insights into different realities? How can we deal with the feeling of detachment when spelling the city you grew up in with one S instead of two, something you just recently learned? There are so many other things to learn, to change. Today, I am again starting from 0. In solidarity with the people who are losing their houses, who are losing their belongings and objects, we are once again looking into a future.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for introducing us to this multitude of histories, actually, from the East. We're talking about remembering. We're talking about memory, about forgetting between Eastern and Western Europe. But let's start with the question. What responsibility does the West have, first of all, to remember this period? But also, how should that remembering, because we also talked about a dominant way of remembering, how should that remembering differ from how it has been remembered up until now? Shall I start? Yes. Okay.
So first, I think, as I referred already to this lack of remembrance, so the lack of institutions, the lack of museums or exhibitions dedicated specifically to that. So that's just kind of something to start with, because as Anna and also Katerina referred to these isolated objects, ruined objects, they are there. So just like memories, living memories are there, but they are not turned into narratives. So there are some artists who are starting to work with these ruins, with these traumas, with these disconnected objects, but this is happening still very sporadically, quite little, and has very little support institutionally. Or if it is remembered, so I refer to these dominant memories. Another example I can refer to is the House of European History in Brussels. Yeah, and so how it represents the transitions, so the 80s and 90s are through a success story, assumed success story of German reunification on the one hand, and there is the tragic story of the wars in Yugoslavia. So just these two shown, represented as extremes, not properly contextualized either. No critical voices involved regarding these two cases, but other cases are not even represented at all. This is the first point. And the second, I think it's important that the so-called former West starts remembering how Western Europe was reshaped also during this time. So if we think about the economic side, for example, so that was the time of economic prosperity following the crisis of the 70s and 80s, the times of austerity. 90s and 2000s were prosperous. Why did it happen? What was the role of neoliberal reforms, not only in the West itself, but also the East, and the move of many businesses, many enterprises, the outsourcing and so on. So why are the 90s remembered as a happy, nonchalant time in Western Europe or in the United States? Why cultural superiority, the sense that we became much better than we used to be, is characterizing these times? And also what was curious is that during this time, a post-colonial turn starts. Yeah, the engagement with the wrongs that the West did in its former colonies. And that engagement has been very productive, and that's why we're using now these tools very often in relation to Eastern Europe, but still too little, I think. But at the same time, this kind of engagement and focus on the post-colonial world and the global South and responsibility to that, to that world has overshadowed somewhat similar processes, in many ways similar processes that were happening in the European East and in Eurasia. I'll stop here. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, is the light green on the?
No.
Oh, maybe to press once.
Yes. Okay. I think first of all, something that you mentioned, and I think that in all our presentations was there, is very important, and that is the fact that we need to also think about this as something that concerns us here. So first of all, why do we always talk about the former East, but the term the former West is not as standard or not as widely circulating as the former East? And I think that's one. And the other thing that I wanted to also add is that I think it is what Anna Rabe said about not always thinking about the GDR or not always telling the story of the GDR from the end, but beginning much earlier, and also telling different stories about this, making alternative voices heard, is very important, but it is not enough, because we cannot then start integrating these stories into our current framework. So I think it's a very more profound process is needed to also rethink the terms that we're using, such as post-socialism or post-communism, because we cannot, or the theories that we're using, you also mentioned knowledge comes to the East, but not really from the East. And that is something that I think needs to change before we can truly accept this as or start also thinking about transitions of the West in the way that we do that for Eastern Europe. So I think it's also very much about deconstructing the frameworks and using academic knowledge and also critical debates in society to change the frameworks and the concepts that we're using in the first place.
Yes, thank you. Maybe you also want to get into this part, but to add one question then, because you were talking about this information traveling from the West to the East instead of from the East to the West. How do we have current attempts from the East to travel the other way? So that you have information from the East traveling to the West, and how do they look like? maybe start with Gunnas, who's actually in, like, let's say, when it comes to the territory, it's quite far away from the Western world.
Sure. I will also connect to your previous question, because I do believe that, I mean, we're here to talk indeed about the late 80s and the 90s as a decade of a lot of transformation that still have the repercussions for our lives today. But at the same time, I think especially in the current situation and the ongoing war, it is important not to overstate the importance of the 90s as the only period of change. Because it is very easy to look back in the 90s, and indeed, as we all do, to look for the seeds of the current conflict back there. And there are, of course, the processes that have long roots that go all the way back to the history. But at the same time, 30 years has passed, and a lot has changed. And indeed, for, I think, the younger generations, it's also important probably to forget that there are certain experiences made and continue to be created that also equally importantly shape our present day situation and how we understand and the roots of the processes that are going on today. And speaking about indeed the information or how the East may be communicating, I think in that sense, living in a globalized world is a help, but also it is a reality that we have to deal with. In a sense, indeed, connecting back to the colleagues, that the boundaries that existed before between the West and the East are very porous today. And I think thinking that, okay, there should be something coming from the East, again, assumes that there is a different East. And maybe instead we should just see us, all of us living in this world and having to deal with the problems that are common to many of us, regardless of the geographic position.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with the first part, like second as well, but especially the first part, because I think what I also speak about in the essay is like this experience of migration in this very time of like post-Soviet, if we want to call it like this, but then really not catching up anymore, like the cultural changes happening since then, no? And it was so many. And I think this is also really important to mention, so I just wanted to emphasize this. And I was also a bit thinking about this, not telling a story from the end. I think it's really interesting, and I think the like thinking about cultural changes and like the end and like vocabularies and how we frame things. I have the feeling there's often a lack of also words or just like means to explain something that is still ongoing. No, so if we talk about the fact that like cultural changes were not happening in the 90s, but there were also like in Ukraine for sure, but also in other areas, cultural changes ongoing. I think it's always really like what our vocabulary is to speak about things that are not finished, because usually it is much easier to frame things that have an end, no? So yeah, also without an answer, but just something I was thinking about in connection of what you both said.
Thank you. Maybe Anna also wants to add something, but I also would like to open up the floor for the audience. First, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say that, well, there are several levels of how East and West communicate. When we look 30 years back and today, and we look at the space of the post-socialist, post-communist realm, we see some countries that had joined the European Union in the meantime, and those that are on a very long accession path. But in both cases, we actually see pretty much the one-way migration. We see a lot of desire on the part of the people, both young and middle-aged, to emigrate temporarily or for good. We don't see any processes going back. So Eastern Europe is perceived as a destination mainly in tourist sense, or mainly as a place where you go for work and you expect to have a lot of fun. So the inequalities are there, they had changed and they had become more cosmetically attractive, but they are very much persisting. And so this thing about any kind of a dialogue is really not there.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Yes. Yes, thank you. The gentleman there.
Can I take it? What I remember is I've lived through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, And what I remember is that there was always talk about freedom and equality and human rights, but that was believed by the Western half of the public and the media. But there was the other half, and they only saw America and NATO and banks and enterprises, the Western multinationals, as attempting to become more rich, to steal all the assets that people, especially in poor countries, had, and that development was talked about, but in reality as much was stolen as possible. So as I see it, and as I have experienced it, when the Iron Curtain fell, the liberalism, the capitalism had won. So there was no resistance of any hope in our, we had also had, like you, we had socialist hopes and communist hopes for, many people were very much in favor of Gorbachev and against the American leaders. And we have lost these hopes, like you have. We have seen that our salaries have come down. That started already in 1980. Mm-hmm. My salary went down by 1,000 guilders a month. And so I think you are in the East, you are, and we in the West, we are victims of, and our opportunities, our hopes of becoming equal, live in a peaceful world, because these forces of money, they don't care about human lives. They'll start wars everywhere just because to have more, better position in competition. Mm. So, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for this comment, and it's about how the transition was lived through. I think it was interesting because in preparing for this meeting, we were talking also about the 80s and how the 80s was lived, or like how what people experienced during the 1980s in the former East, but that also in the former West there was a crisis going on. There was an economic crisis going on, which is interesting when you're talking about a common or an uncommon or a non-shared history, even though they do not per se feel shared at that time. In a way, there is a shared or a common part in that history. Are there other questions?
I may add to that. Yeah, thanks so much for this comment, for this intervention. I think, yeah, it really points out at who profited from these transitions, and that should be seen in not West versus East-West, but in much more nuanced, yeah, in a social way, so which social groups actually profited and who lost. And also you pointed out to this period, and I think this is what should be remembered, as the death of the socialist alternative. Yeah, with its different hopes and realizations all over the world.
Yeah. Can I add something?
If it's a quick one, you can add something.
Yes. Can I have the microphone? Thank you. The media are taken over by the money. So they only tell the West this positive story about the West. And this vision that I talked about, and that was especially by intellectuals, was shared in the before the Iron Curtain fell, is completely diminished from the view and from the media and from anywhere. So when I say things like this, most people are aggressive towards me because they hear all the time that the West is so positive and doing its best, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that is actually, when you touched upon the globalization, but also let's talk about this more accessibility of different media. I do think we have more media coming up again that show different perspectives, but for a great part, there is a very dominant view within the media in itself. There was a question there.
One of the themes that multiple people touched on was kind of this assimilation approach with the West and a bigger focus on what the West was offering and not really looking at with the East. With the perspective of today, what would you say or view as kind of key cultural or economic exports, or practices, things like that, that are really kind of being made manifest in the West today, or things that are really important but have been overlooked?
Expert from the East to the West?
So from the East to the West.
I think the brain drain is the main.
Yeah, well, I already mentioned this. People from the East, they're voting with their feet, as they normally, as it is called. So people are just aiming to leave, and they're aiming to find and to be educated in the professions that are marketable, so that they can remain and fulfill their dreams about the house, about everything else that makes people today uniformly happy. So this is a general cultural export. I don't see anything else to add to this. There are very few people, going back to what the gentleman said earlier, there are very few people who actually try to deal with the situation from what could be said more solidarity. I deliberately avoid the term left because it is so loaded. So I'd say from the solidarity perspective, and the creativity perspective. So many of us prefer to deal with the activists and artists who refuse precisely the coherent narrative, who avoid museumized knowledge and prefer the ruins.
Yes? Yes.
Thank you. But there's, you're all from with roots in the East, but there's nothing to be proud of in the East. So you can make a voice to the West. Do you understand what I said?
Is the question that they can make a statement about something to be that they are proud of from the East?
A message from the East to the West.
Okay.
Because you are proud of it. Huh?
I'm not sure if the word proud would be the one thing that we want to state here, but we want to give a diverse view, or a more diverse view of the transition period and what it also meant in different areas. But I would find it an interesting question to say something. On the one hand, it's about what you might be proud of, but also what do you feel maybe should be more remembered in the West?
You probably mean that we focused on the very negative side. Yeah, so the negative side that is not remembered in the narrative that celebrate this time. So what would be the positive thing that should be remembered? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe as a slightly different interpretation of the question, but I was thinking about it just now. Together with a student of mine, I have been recently compiling a sort of database of newspaper articles that were published both in West Germany by West German newspapers, as well as in the East by several different Eastern German newspapers between, let's say, 1985 and the early 90s. And what was interesting is that you see certain shifts in the narrative from maybe also hopes of reforming socialism, of creating a different type of GDR, of society, also more different kinds of voices that can be heard in newspapers after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then also shifts towards a more pessimistic view of we are going to lose, what we stand for. And I think it's important to maybe also via newspapers or by other texts or artistic media or reflections that were written at the time, go back and see what are maybe the shifts that we can see, but also maybe the alternative hopes that were written about or thought about at the time. And I think that's a really interesting process of maybe not just looking at it from a memory perspective, so how do we remember these periods now as a society or as individuals, but also maybe going back to things that were written or created during the times of transitions and seeing were there any alternatives visualized or things that we maybe passed by and didn't get integrated into this other narrative that became very dominant. So to maybe reinterpret your question a little bit, but that's what I was thinking of when you were speaking.
Katharina?
Yeah, I don't know where to start. I think this is why everyone is a bit silent. Because I think I was just thinking about cultural objects, as Xenia Robbo also mentioned in the beginning, no? And there are so many, so I don't know where to start. In terms of what is worth looking at from the East, no? Just like maybe to give, I don't know, I was thinking of two. If a Ukrainian writer I recently really fell in love with, called Oksana Zabushko. There's also a filmmaker called Kira Muratova. It is on YouTube. And now I could continue for like 2 hours, and I think all of us, and this is why the question itself is brought like some silence, no? Because it's also like, I guess not us having to tell about what is worth bringing in, but also researching and looking yourself, no?
Similarly, reflecting on your question, probably one of the answers that indeed I was thinking will be to connect to the region we were born, the country we come from. You know, in this case, I talked about Tatarstan, so there will be the immediate answer, okay, what is impressive or what is good to remember or good to tell or bring to the West about Tatarstan? However, exactly in following the current discussions about the future of Russia and possible developments, hopefully after the soon end of the war, a lot of people think in ethnic terms, that indeed Russia is a multi-ethnic country, has different ethnic groups that, of course, currently disproportionately affected. So there is a tendency to divide the country into ethnic regions and the communities. And of course, that has also some basic, the base for it, because as a federation, it consists of certain republics. However, at the same time, exactly looking back at the Yugoslavian history and the turbulences of the Europe of the 80s, of the 90s, personally, I do believe that thinking in ethnic terms in itself can be dangerous and not necessarily a fulfilling way to indeed to look at the country or the region in itself. And in the process, I still do not have an answer, but ideally it will be, I think, a fruitful way to think about myself as indeed the generation of the 90s, as someone that comes from a specific region, not so much in ethnic terms, but maybe across the generation or across the region, and thereby look for connections with different countries and maybe something even outside of the region. So there is no concrete answer, but at the same time, I think this is more encouragement to not to box all these regions that we're talking about necessarily in geography and ethnicity, but try indeed to look more in broader terms that allow connections.
Just to I have my, yeah, also to connect and thinking through your question, and also reflecting on Katerina's essays she was reading. So I was struck by this example that you mentioned of your friend who liked olives and thought of Ukraine belonging to the Mediterranean because of olives there. And that was striking for me in terms of forgetting this belonging, yes, the sense of belonging to a bigger world, yeah, with no national borders. Something that, yeah, also inspired by your comment. Belonging to something bigger and something that is more interconnected and entangled than how we think about Eastern Europe today as divided by especially national boundaries. And so how this also sense of belonging has been narrowed down by by the aspirations of becoming European. Yeah, so because there are two layers through which this comment about olives can be read. Yeah, so I belong to this larger Southern European region without borders, or I belong to Europe, which I still have to reach from Ukraine. Yeah, so this is just.
I think also what is interesting here is, do we talk about a certain product that was, let's say, almost exported, or is it also about creating space for people to talk about daily life, which was a lot more colorful than is usually imagined in, let's say, the former West? So to give space for all these different stories that you have. There is a question of... Yes, of course, and after that we'll go to you.
I think this is, of course, a caveat, because you create a panel and you invite people who come from very different disciplines, but at the same time you identify them by their origin, so you guess where they're coming from, whether they look Slavic or Tatar or Mongol or Jewish, and then you can sort of extrapolate. But that is something would happen with the panel if you were to talk about Sudan or similar things. But at the same time, like Evelina just said, this is really the story of actually talking about things that were very ordinary, and that actually creating extraordinarity was not something that is the essence of the people. This is ontologically, and it is unimaginable. This is exoticization that I think we all here are very much against. And so also asking people who come from somewhere. I remember when I was a student in the US, and I was funded by some general's wife's funding for a small part of tuition, so they expected me to come in a folk dress to the lunch that I was invited to. This is just something that you don't expect from people coming from the Netherlands, to appear somewhere in a folk dress to tell you how they are. So I think that should answer plenty of questions.
So we have room for one more question.
My bad.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. So I don't know that much as you about it, but there's this German politician called Gregor Gysi. He's always mentioning that the only thing the West took from the East Germany is the green arrow we put at the traffic light. So, and he's always saying that there's a lot of like women rights and childcare was much better at this time in the east of Germany than in west of Germany. So maybe a follow-up to what the question before. So is this something which is maybe true for the more wider region in the east, and is this something you could, not you, but the east could export more to us?
So this is also something that we talked about previously, and that's what I was kind of mentioning or referring to when I was talking about daily life. How was daily life in a way, like what are the topics that we do not talk about? So maybe it's also a part of what is actually the part that we're forgetting. And one of those things would be women's right, or like how society was structured. So does someone want to add to that? Maybe also examples of daily life. So we have an example of women's rights here. Like, are there other examples of daily life that you would say that is being forgotten, but that we actually should remember? Dorine?
I can just say, because I showed some of the ruins that are appearing in the films, and some of these ruins are not just the residues of the war. The residues of the war also are the residues of industry and of work and of employment lost. And so this is just something, again, that gets covered by the stories of violence and something that looks very exotic, that's something that doesn't happen anywhere else. But I was trying to tell that the stories of violence are necessarily intertwined with the stories of the loss of the everyday, and the everyday is everywhere the same. It's the work which should be rewarding, but that is becoming humiliating. if you have it. So that's the ordinarity. The other ordinarities that is lost in this realm of the ruins is the stories of friendships, of how people help one another, and how this type of sentiment and connection is actually lost in the world of the ruins.
Yeah, so that's not just forgotten, it's actually lost. Dorine?
Yeah, just as a very brief comment, which I found really nice, as also a response from the writer to her book, and it was, I forgot if it was a conversation or an interview on paper, but there was this question that was very heavily focused on what we can learn from this book about the history of the GDR and the negative aspects, and that was a sort of leading question asked, and the writer herself, she responded, no, this is a love story. This is, yeah, it is not always about politics, and it is not always or only about what we can learn about this society. It is also a story of two people falling in love and it going very horribly wrong, I would say, in the course of this relationship. But I think that was a good comment. It is also a love story. It is first and foremost a love story.
Yeah. One last one.
Can I add a question which relates to this? Because I wanted to ask Gulnaz Sibgatulina about, you spoke about, and it struck me very much, about the generational differences in remembering the 90s, which, if I understood you correctly, you said that the younger generations were actually remembering the positive things of the 90s rather than the older generations. And what were these positive things then that people are rallying around when remembering the 90s? That's what I want to ask you.
So indeed, in my talk, I did talk about the generational gap, but mostly speaking about the memories of the older generation that still thinks in a positive sense about the 90s for different reasons. But at the same time, indeed, one of the hopeful conclusions is that I think for the young generation, although, if I may speak for myself, there is a lot of confusion at the moment and there is a lot of soul-searching for answers, which easily leads to disregarding the experiences of our parents, of our grandparents. I do believe that there is still room also for us to come to terms with the 90s in a positive sense. Because as we talked before, the period is very multi-sided. And there are things, I do believe, that we share between generations that are truly were positive, regardless of the a lot of negative areas that existed in parallel. So my argument is more that these are not exclusive, that we tend to see the negative, but there is still positive does exist.
What are these positive things?
Again, I cannot speak for the whole, but in my sense, it is, regardless of the nuances, it's still the point of union, it's still a point of political agency, it is still the point of, indeed, concrete vision of the future that existed at that moment. And I do believe it was still the time when there was a window of opportunity to think about ourselves, and in this case, I do believe as like a Tatar community, in a different ways, not necessarily in a very conservative, traditionally defined ethnic terms. And I do believe the 90s had those moments. And maybe one of the ways to reconcile and to connect to the experience of our parents is indeed to look for those moments. And maybe there are still the doors that we can still open and access and go there.
So at this point, I would like to say, with an eye on the time, and I see that there is some discussion still going on, but I would like to invite everybody from the public to continue the discussion over a few drinks. I would like to thank you, our audience, for being here. I would like to thank our colleagues from Spui 25 for making this possible, and I most of all want to thank all our speakers on stage for being here. Thank you very much, and please join me for some drinks.